Finishing up with the final episode of this over-the-top dual battery wireless keyboard build. We're doing more cosmetic mods, we're installing the switches, and finally putting it all together and testing it out. This project has been a long time coming and we finally made it to the end, so let's go. Last time we had just finished printing all of the graphics onto the acrylic panels. We've pretty much modded everything on this build so far except for the keyboard itself. I also show you how I removed all the old switches from the keyboard in the last episode, and that's what we're going to tackle right now. I could have just tossed in all the new switches and called it a day, but I figured I'd take advantage of the fact that I have a blank slate here and I'm gonna try and dress it up a bit. Since this keyboard is already aesthetically way over the top, I figured why stop here. Normally I would just paint a part like this, but the vinyl affords you a reflectivity that isn't easily achieved through painting. This was super easy to apply. The hardest parts, or most tedious parts, were cutting out all of the holes I needed for the switches and stabilizers. Even though the keycaps cover most of the plate when they're installed, you can still catch a glimpse of the plate color between the small gaps in the keycaps. Having this part as reflective as it is with the vinyl does create a really cool effect. When using vinyl wrap, this opens you up to all kinds of patterns and colors that you couldn't otherwise get with normal paint. This was pretty easy to do, it just took a little bit of time cutting out all the holes, and even though the edges are a bit rough, you're not going to see them because the switches are going to cover them. Now that we have our plate looking how we want it, we can move on to actually installing the new switches. I did want to point out that these little switch jars are pretty cool and there is some novelty of popping the tops off. The only problem is once you do that, you no longer have a top for this jar. Even though the jars themselves do accept a screw top, one was not provided. Even though it's just a minor thing, I think if you can increase the reusability of something, why not? Anyway, the switches themselves are actually really cool. They're super cheap, and because of that, I was expecting the quality to be terrible. I was expecting them to feel terrible, but they actually feel very good and they sound quite decent. Here I am just installing some of the switches in all of the corners to try and get the plate leveled before I put in all the other switches. They were a tiny bit harder to push into place because of that vinyl being so thick and taking up some of the space, but it was very easy to install all these switches. I still can't get over how impeccably they match the rest of this keyboard's aesthetics. Now that they're all popped in there, I just have to solder the leads to the board. Not sure why I went so heavy-handed with the solder on these two pins, maybe it was for the camera, but yeah, the other ones came out a lot better. Next up was the tedious job of installing all of the LEDs for the switches. Even though it's very straightforward to do and I've done it tons of times, this was the hardest part of the entire build and gave me the most frustration. I didn't film almost any of it other than the last parts you're seeing right here, but some of the LEDs I installed just didn't work outright, so I had to replace them, and once you've already created a pocket of solder in the holes, it's really hard to get that out, and I didn't have my solder sucker with me, so yeah, that job was super annoying. I really wanted to go with all yellow LEDs, although I didn't quite have enough to finish all of these switches. So I just used a whole mix of different LEDs. Some were orange, some were warm white, some were chartreuse, which is kind of like a yellow-green color. I figured if I really didn't like them, I'll just install new LEDs later, but I actually was pretty happy with how they came out. I ended up running into some issues with the final wiring because I wanted to clean these up and make them more efficient. I realized I could make a lot of the runs a lot shorter and cut down on some of this wiring mass. This was not only going to make it easier to install the final pieces of the case, but it was also going to make the wiring look even cleaner. I also needed to rewire some of this switch because one of the labels I put on the front of the case was actually incorrect from the actual operation. This happened because I changed the functionality first and then I made a mental note part of changing the label, but then when I went to go print them, I didn't actually change the label, so I had to rewire it back the other way. Since these batteries are so large, that's free real estate for graphics, so I'm gonna take advantage of those too. If you remember, those were part of the overall back graphic, but I etched those onto the vinyl so that there's kind of a layered structure going on. All that's left at this point was to just put all the pieces back together and fully assemble it finally for the last time. At this point, I've been working on this keyboard for several months now, so I can't tell you how excited I was to get to this point. I honestly think that it came out incredible. This is so much crazier and more ridiculous looking than I had ever imagined when I first started this project. I totally understand that this is not everybody's aesthetic, with everything being now clean and minimal and Mac-like, and that being kind of like the zeitgeist of what good design is, and I set out to design something that was pretty much to fly in the face of that aesthetic. I set out to make something very unique, very eye-catching, and hopefully not something that you've seen very often in a keyboard. I basically wanted to make something that if there was a keyboard in the game Cyberpunk 2077, that this keyboard would be something you could pull out of the screen and have physically in real life. Now you may think that this is too gaudy or garish and over the top, which is of course a very valid criticism, but my whole point was making something different, and I think objectively this keyboard looks very different from a lot of other keyboards out there. Now I can't just put any old keycaps on this keyboard because it is so over the top that I need a set that is just equally as over the top. Again, I drew more inspiration from Cyberpunk and I went with a full color, full all over print, custom printed keycap set. I actually used a transparent base layer in the hopes that that would bring more illumination to the keycaps. I'm really glad I made that decision over opaque keys because I think the effect looks really cool. Because I put a NeoPixel LED strip on the bottom front of the keyboard, it also has an integrated controller on the side. Those 3 buttons on the side that you can access below the handle allows you to change the different modes, speeds, and colors of the strip. This controller has over 30 or 40 different animations, different color blends, cycles, things like that, and you can just play around with them all through the buttons on the side of the keyboard. But even if you want the lights off, I still think the keyboard stands alone without even all of the crazy lighting going on. Another unique thing about this board, it has 2 independent batteries going on, so you flip the switch and you can charge both packs at the same time or just one of them. You can also charge while you're using the keyboard as well. As you guys remember, I did have to modify this portion of the build a little bit and it's not as perfect or as clean as I wanted it to be, but I can save that for a version 2. Not only does this keyboard look super crazy, it also actually works, and it works pretty well. Let me briefly walk you through all of its different modes. You have wired mode, and here you just plug it in and use it like a regular keyboard. You can see the USB indicator lighting up when you are in wired mode, and that also turns on the keyboard. The keyboard is completely receiving power from the computer, and you can run all of the lighting, and it just doesn't use any of the battery. It's plugged in just like a regular wired keyboard. It's also a native direct connection, so you can flash firmware and do all that just from the wired connection. But this keyboard is also wireless, so if you flip on the Bluetooth switch, you can see me connected with no wires whatsoever. It's a wireless keyboard. You can see I have battery 1 turned on from the indicator, and all of the functions work, and it's all running off the first battery. And what happens if you run out of the first battery? You just flip it onto battery 2 and it reconnects within seconds, and then there you go. You're running off a full nother charged pack. You can see from the giant indicators whether you're on wired or wireless mode, and also which battery you're using. As I said in my earlier episodes, that I'm using the handheld scientific BT500 for the wireless conversion, because this is a native wired keyboard that I converted to wireless. The performance of the module is excellent, and there's no discernible difference between typing in wired and wireless modes. These battery packs are 6,000 milliamps at 5 volts, so that's a pretty big pack even for one of them, and this board has 2 of them, so that should allow you to type for a very long time. And here's a small typing demo so you can hear how the keyboard sounds. With the 2 batteries, this thing should last about 100 hours of continuous use, which would definitely give you a lot of time between charges if you're just using the keyboard wirelessly. The idea for this board actually came out of my first wireless conversion video, and one of the limitations and frustrations was not having enough room in the case for the battery. And because of that idea, here is this case where I knew if I designed the case from the ground up, I'd have as much room for the batteries as I wanted. Many months ago, I had no idea that it was eventually going to turn into this monstrosity, but I'm very glad that it did. Honestly, this board came out so much better than I had ever imagined. As I was going, I just added little elements here and there, and they all added up to something that was so much cooler than I had originally thought. I really like the compact size. I love the integrated handle. It's really portable, and you can just kind of carry it around. Honestly, it feels more like a weapon than a keyboard, which I think is pretty cool. Due to the way that I had to design this, I figured in the end it was more going to be just an art piece that I showed people as opposed to something that I actually used. I figured because of how tall I had to make it with the batteries that it was going to be very uncomfortable to type with. So I've been pretty blown away with just how comfortable the keyboard is to type on and how usable it is. As I said before, the switches feel great, they sound really good, and overall I'm just really impressed with the actual functionality of the keyboard. This build did take me a lot longer than I had anticipated, although I was kind of juggling a bunch of other projects going on at the same time. It's also by no means perfect. There were a ton of hiccups and workarounds I had to do while I was building it, so I definitely want to come and revisit this with a new updated design. I also want to create something similar, but also adding a CyberDeck functionality, so pretty much basically integrating a computer into the keyboard as well, so let me know if you guys want to see that. I am super happy with how it came out, even though it was a ton of work and a lot of things to figure out to get it to this point, but I am very, very happy, and I'm also very relieved that this project is finished so I can focus on other projects I have in the works. I really hope you guys enjoyed how this project came out in the end finally, and I also hope you guys enjoyed pretty much showing the entire process from start to finish of how I designed and created this keyboard. If you have been following along for the whole process, I really appreciate that, as well as watching all the way to the end of this video. I also appreciate that. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have a ton more projects in the queue, and I want to thank you guys so much for watching again. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.